Quote, "The senator from Indiana, Mr. Pettit, has made a long argument tonight to prove the inferiority of the African race. I say to the senator from Indiana that I know men of that race who are quite equal in mental power to either the senator from Indiana or myself, men who are scarcely inferior, in that respect, to any senators upon this floor. But, sir, suppose the senator from Indiana succeeds in establishing the inferiority of that despised race. Is mental inferiority a valid reason for the perpetual oppression of a race? Is the mental, moral, or physical inferiority of a man a just cause of oppression in a Republican and Christian America? Sir, is this democracy? Is it Christian? Democracy cares for the poor, the lowly, the humble. Democracy demands that the panoply of just and equal laws shall shield and protect the weakest of Ib's sons of men. Sir, these are the strange doctrines to lean hittered in the Senate of Republican America, whose political institutions are based upon the fundamental idea that all men are created equal." This is a passage from now Senator Henry Wilson's first speech on the floor of the United States Senate. This is Henry Wilson and the Civil War. Before we delve into Wilson's early days in the Senate, it's important that we review some of the national figures who will be of great interest in the following years in order to give some context. Some of these figures we've already discussed. First, William Lloyd Garrison. Garrison was an ardent abolitionist and spread his passionate views in his newspaper, The Liberator. The main mission of the paper was to spread the principles and news surrounding abolition. Garrison held some radical and unorthodox ideas about how the United States upheld and supported the institution of slavery. He believed that the Constitution was in itself a slave document and should be rewritten to uphold the values of equality and freedom. Garrison and his supporters vowed not to participate in governmental functions, including not paying taxes or voting. The next figure of the times is Frederick Douglass. Douglass was born into slavery. His father was a white slave master, and his mother an enslaved woman. At an early age, he was separated from his family and put to work. From a very young age, Douglass witnessed the sheer brutalities of slavery, and would later go on to make an escape and become a writer and orator, traveling the world, telling the story of the American slave. Douglass was especially influential in abolitionist circles during the 1850s and 60s. Douglass's views on the Constitution evolved over time, with him originally supporting the Garrisonian argument that the Constitution was a slave document and that the fundamental values underpinning America was slavery. Though as time went on, Douglass began to support the idea that the fundamental values of America are of equality and freedom, but they were not being upheld by the Constitution or the government. Another name we should be familiar with, if you aren't already, is Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was an Illinois senator and state legislator. He served just one term in the House of Representatives from 1847 to 1849, in which he was one of the few dissenting votes in the declaration of the Mexican-American War. Lincoln re-entered politics in 1854 to be one of the key leaders of the newly forming Republican Party. Lincoln held moderate views when it came to slavery, supporting gradual emancipation and colonization efforts to send enslaved blacks to Africa. Lincoln ran for the Illinois U.S. Senate seat in 1858 against our next name to review, Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas was the senator of Illinois and one of the key compromisers in the Compromise of 1850, and the man who got the repeal of the Missouri Compromise passed. Douglas believed in keeping the Union together and believed that political compromise was the only way to do that. Douglas was indifferent when it came to the question of the slave, believing in popular sovereignty, the belief that the white men of each state should have the power to allow or prohibit slavery in their state, with no power being given to the federal government. Henry Wilson leaned more towards the Garrisonian camp when it came to his views. Wilson believed in total abolition and racial equality, though he didn't reject the Constitution and political institutions as Garrison did. Wilson, of course, believed in and participated in the electoral process, and believed that the only way to peacefully resolve the slave question was complete abolition by the federal government. This isn't to say that Wilson was always uncompromising. Wilson would compromise up to the point of where the goal of abolition was reached. To put it simply, both Wilson and Garrison had the same goal of abolition, but their ways of going about it were greatly different. After Wilson's win and his long train ride to Washington, as Wilson entered the Senate, the nation was raging in the debate around the Nebraska bill and whether or not the states of Nebraska and Kansas would be slave or free.
By the time you get to the 1850s, those tensions had grown to such a level that the Senate was literally being torn apart by them.
This is the voice of Betty Coed, a historian from the United States Senate.
My name is Betty Coed, and I am the U.S. Senate historian and the director of the Senate Historical Office. I've been a Senate historian since 1998, and we have our offices here in Washington, D.C. on Capitol Hill. I'm in the Hart Building, which is right across the street from the U.S. Capitol. And one of the principal features of our office is to explore the biographies of many of the forgotten men and women who have studied, who have served in the U.S. Senate. One of them is Henry Wilson, so I'm happy to be here. So when Henry Wilson comes to the Senate in the 1850s, he comes to the Senate that's essentially in turmoil. And it was a little bit like coming in the midst of a volcanic eruption. Everything was just exploding right and left. And Henry Wilson was one of these people who was a pragmatist by nature, but a strong abolitionist, and was looking for ways that he could avoid civil war, but still solve the issue of abolishing slavery.
As Wilson entered the city, it was a bitterly cold week. Just a few months went by when the debate over what Kansas would be went from words to weapons, culminating in the breakout of the Bleeding Kansas affair. During Kansas's first election in 1854, pro- and anti-slavery advocates fled the state, attempting to hijack the vote over whether the new state would be slave or free. The pro-slavery advocates, also called border ruffians, held a strong majority and elected mostly pro-slavery representatives. When the time came for the election of the legislature in March 1855, in which key decisions would be made on whether or not the state would be slave or free, these border ruffians re-entered the state, heavily armed, and attempted to intimidate anti-slavery voters. Anti-slavery advocates, also known as Jayhawks, also entered the state, and when pro-slavery forces cheated their way to victory, the Jayhawks refused to accept this outcome and set up a separate anti-slavery government. Violence quickly ensued, with ragtag militias pouncing on one another, fighting for control of the state, essentially starting a mini-civil war in Kansas. Throughout Wilson's first year in office, his time was spent forcefully fighting pro-slavery forces in ways that no senator had done before. In a sermon on July 1st, 1855, renowned abolitionist pastor Theodore Parker said, quote, "Massachusetts, within a few months, has taken a man from a shoemaker's bench and placed him in the Senate, in the very chair left vacant by the most scholarly man who had fallen from it, and rolled, wallowing in the dust at his feet. And, when the senatorial shoemaker speaks, brave words of right and justice, and in these times he speaks no other, the people, not only of Massachusetts, but all of the North, rise up and say, 'Well done, here are our hands for you.'" End quote. Most of Wilson's work in 1855 was dedicated to party affairs in Massachusetts, and his and others' efforts to build a strong and long-lasting coalition of anti-slavery men to form a successful Republican Party in Massachusetts. As Know-Nothings nationally became more passionate about their nativist principles and less so about their anti-slavery passions, Wilson realized the Know-Nothing Party didn't have the qualities needed to become a successful abolitionist party. At the Know-Nothing Convention in Philadelphia, the delegates refused to seat the Massachusetts delegation. When Wilson eventually was welcomed, though hastily, he spoke in favor of adopting strong anti-slavery resolutions. Many of the Know-Nothings, especially the large Southern contingent, gave him and his fellow delegates a stunning rebuke, heckling and shouting insults when Wilson spoke, though his unsuccessful yet forceful push gained him national notoriety. As Amasa Walker put it, he was, quote, at the head of the political anti-slavery movement in the North, end quote. Throughout Wilson's first year in office, he had gained newfound national fame in the anti-slavery spotlight and had increased popularity in Massachusetts. As the violence in Kansas continued to bleed into 1856, Wilson requested information to be released on the affairs by President Pierce. When Wilson received the report on the state of affairs in Kansas, he delivered a speech to the Senate, which was spread nationally and gained him more widespread notoriety. The year earlier, Wilson had wrote that, quote, the next Congress will be the most violent one in our history. It will try our firmness. I hope our friends will meet the issues bravely, and if violence and bloodshed come, let us not falter, but do our duty, even if we fall on the floors of Congress. In an event that would push the nation closer to war, bring national fame to Henry Wilson, and nearly kill him and his colleague, his prediction of violence would be realized. On May 19th, Charles Sumner rose in the extremely hot and overcrowded Senate chamber and delivered a fiery speech denouncing the violence in Kansas. In his 112-page speech, titled The Crime Against Kansas, Sumner brutally attacked slavery and made personal attacks on its allies in the Senate, being especially brutal to South Carolina Senator Andrew Butler. Butler wasn't present in the Senate that day, though his cousin, a member of the House, Preston Brooks, was. The Crime Against Kansas speech was personally insulting to other senators, calling Senator Stephen Douglas a noisome, squat, and nameless animal, not a proper model for an American senator, and accusing Andrew Butler of essentially having an affair with slavery. Sumner said Butler had a mistress, quote, who, though ugly to others, is always lovely to him, though polluted in the sight of the world, is chaste in his sight. I mean the harlot of slavery, end quote. Wilson biographer Ernest Mackay wrote, quote, Sumner must have been carried away with the preoccupation for literary style and forgot that he was talking about real people who felt the weight of his words. It was a bad speech and bad taste, which, taken alone, could only harm his cause, end quote. In the 1800s, the desks in the Senate chamber were used as working spaces for senators. As the Senate adjourned, Sumner stuck around his desk, working on preparing copies of his speech to sign and distribute. After the insulting and fiery speech, Wilson, fearful of the safety of his friend and colleague, approached Sumner and said, I'm bringing you home today. Several of us are going home with you. To which Sumner responded, none of that, Wilson.
So in May of 1856, Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner delivered a really fiery and controversial speech that he termed the crime against Kansas. And the speech was designed to denounce the members of Congress who had supported the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. And that bill was a turning point in the debate over slavery, because when the bill passed, it allowed for the expansion of slavery into Western territories. And that was the very thing that the abolitionists had tried so hard to avoid. And at the end of the speech, the the Senate was there to hear the speech, and a lot of them were shocked by what they heard because Sumner used very graphic language. He used very radical language to make his points, and was very insulting to people. I mean, he referred to Andrew Butler as someone who would associate with harlots, and he associated Stephen Douglas with being this sort of squat animal. And so it was a very insulting speech and not one that the Senate was used to hearing at the time.
3 days later, as Henry Wilson was leaving the Senate chamber, Representative Preston Brooks was passing by, and Wilson exchanged a bow. Wilson left the Capitol and departed for his residence in the city. As Wilson left, Brooks entered the chamber and waited for the room to empty, then approaching Sumner, who was focused on his work.
Sumner was actually sitting at his desk signing his frank, or signing copies of the speech to be delivered to friends and colleagues. And the member of the House comes up to the Senator Sumner, raises his heavy walking cane, and says to Sumner something along the lines of, I've heard your speech, and I take offense at your speech for myself, for my relatives, and for my state. And over the next minute, he mercilessly beat Sumner with the cane. He inflicted about 40 wounds on Charles Sumner over the course of about a minute.
As Sumner was stuck between the desk and his chair, Brooks continued to strike him, brutally beating him.
People around were shocked at what they saw, but they were shocked almost into silence and inaction. Preston Brooks, a member of the House of Representatives who committed this crime, came into the chamber backed by other members, and so there were people there to sort of defend him and hold back any people who would get in his way if necessary. But there were people in the Senate who were just so shocked at what they saw, it took them a while to respond. And by that time, Sumner was left unconscious and bleeding on the floor of the Senate chamber.
A colleague ran out to find Wilson, who was not out of the Capitol yet, and alerted him to what had happened. Wilson rushed back to the Senate chamber to find an unconscious and badly beaten up Sumner, lying, covered in blood and still bleeding. Wilson and other senators carried Sumner to the vice president's office in the Capitol, where a doctor was standing by. Wilson accompanied Sumner back to his home, where he would continue to be treated.
Henry Wilson was one of the people who had left the chamber, was down the hall and came back in, and he was one of the people who helped to get Sumner out of the chamber and home to get medical treatment later on that day.
Wilson and a small group of Republicans met that night and discussed what they needed to do going forward. The day after the attack on Sumner, Wilson rose in the Senate and delivered a brief address explaining Sumner's absence, and called for a senior member to request an investigation. The investigation that came had no Republicans on the committee and offered no more than a denouncement of the attack. The North grew outraged by the incident, and groups gathered by the thousands across Massachusetts.
In the wake of that event, these two figures, Charles Sumner for the Northern abolitionists and Preston Brooks for the Southern slaveholders, become iconic figures. And Sumner becomes sort of a martyr to the cause of emancipation, whereas Brooks becomes this hero to Southern slaveholders. And in fact, people began to send Brooks new walking sticks, new canes in the mail, with notes of "beat 'em again" and things like that. Both the House and the Senate investigated what they called at the time the Brooks-Sumner affair. And the House actually voted to discipline him and get him out, to get Brooks out of office. But Brooks was immediately reelected back into his spot, so he stayed.
A few days later, Wilson delivered a speech which he decried the attacks as brutal, murderous, and cowardly, to which Preston Brooks shouted, "You are a liar." Later that week, Brooks challenged Wilson to a duel. Delivering a speech the next day, Wilson said, quote, "I characterized, on the floor of the Senate, the assault upon my colleague as brutal, murderous, and cowardly. I thought so then, I think so now. I have no qualification whatsoever in regard to those words. I have never entertained, in the Senate or elsewhere, the idea of personal responsibility in the sense of the duelist. I have always regarded dueling as the lingering relic of a barbarous civilization, which the law of the country has branded a crime. While, therefore, I religiously believe in the right of self-defense in its broadest sense, the law of my country, in the matured convictions of my whole life, alike forbid me to meet you for the purpose indicated in your letter." End quote. Wilson, fearful of blowback from his speech, sent a telegraph to his wife Harriet, back in Natick. Quote, "Have declined to fight a duel, shall do my duty, and leave the result with God. If assailed, shall defend my life, if possible, at any cost. Be calm." End quote. He also sent letters to his friends, John Alley and William Clayfin, requesting they take care of his 10-year-old son, Henry Hamilton, if something were to happen. From this point forward, Wilson always carried around 2 guns. Though his fight against slavery had risked his life, Wilson said, quote, "My mind is made up. I shall walk the path of duty, if it costs my life." End quote. Here's a passage from a letter that Wilson wrote to a friend and minister, Theodore Parker, days after the attack. Quote, "If I had been near him, I should have grappled with Brooks. I shall never cease to regret that I was not by the side of my colleague and friend when assailed." End quote. When he returned to Massachusetts for the Republican Convention, he was greeted with great applause and celebration, now a national symbol of courage and heroism in the North, and of cowardice in the South. Both his friends and foes celebrated the 2 senators, with Charles Francis Adams proposing a resolution celebrating Wilson's reaction to the attack and duel. Adams took the opportunity to make amends with Wilson and use their relationship as an example to get over past fights with former foes, to join together in the fight against Southern chivalry.
Brooks died not long after this. He was not an old man, but he died of an illness not too long after this. Sumner, however, lived on. He left the Senate in 1856. He didn't leave as a member, but he went home to recuperate, and he spent most of the next 3 years recuperating from his injuries. He never completely recovered from it. He suffered with headaches and types of seizures and things like that for most of the rest of his life. But he did go away. He traveled for a while. He came back to the Senate full time in 1859 and then served out the rest of his career there until he died in 1874. So this moment in time for Senate history is very important because it's a turning point from the era of the Senate where legislative compromises had helped to quelch the debate, to calm the issue so that they could move forward in a way without dealing with the issue of slavery. But after the caning of Charles Sumner in 1856, it became clear to everyone that these kinds of legislative compromises would no longer solve the issue. So it's an important turning point. It's also important because these 2 figures do become these iconic symbols of the North versus the South. While Sumner is away recovering, his desk is left in the chamber covered in black drapery, and it's a lasting symbol of the violence of the issue that had finally come to rest in the Senate chamber itself.
With Sumner unable to participate in Senate activities, Wilson fulfilled the duties of his absent colleague, essentially serving as both Massachusetts senators. Here again is the voice of Wilson biographer John L. Myers.
Well, one of the interesting things that resulted from that attack on Sumner is that Wilson essentially was the only representative in the Senate from Massachusetts for a considerable length of time. So I suppose that was good. There is no question that his reply to Brooks was a very strong reply and could have endangered either a reaction from Brooks or a reaction from someone else. it showed a bit of courage on the part of Wilson to take the stand he did.
1856 brought with it so much turmoil and tension, and even more was expected with it being an election year. With Wilson's newfound fame and his fitting role as a leader in the newly forming Republican Party, his attention was needed to coalesce the party around a fitting candidate for president. This was an episode that I've been looking forward to getting to for a while. We covered Wilson's early days in the Senate, the start of Bleeding Kansas, and of course the attack on Henry Wilson's colleague and friend, Charles Sumner. The next few episodes will be some of the most interesting, and I can't wait to continue sharing Wilson's life with all of you. A special thanks to my many guests from today's episode. First, Betty Coed from the United States Senate for her great help in telling the story of the attack on Senator Sumner. She'll continue to help guide us through Wilson's career more thoroughly throughout the series. Another thank you to Wilson biographer John L. Myers for his input on this episode. Thank you so much for taking the journey through Henry Wilson's life with me. If you haven't already, I encourage you to subscribe or follow so you don't miss any new episodes. And if you're interested in seeing some more information on Wilson's life, check out HenryWilsonHistory.com, my website dedicated to information on Wilson. If you have any questions or comments you'd like to share, please email them to HenryWilsonPodcast@gmail.com, and I will do my best to respond in a future episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I can't wait to continue through the life of Henry Wilson.